like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. John Paul Stevens, and I told him I was going to say I call you JP, but I will say your whole name on this occasion. Dr. John Paul Stevens is Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at Case Western Reserve University's Weatherhead School of Management. His research explores work relationships and coordination in groups and focuses on how individuals and teams perceive their behaviors in complex, interdependent workplaces. Stevens' other work interests include performance adaptation, mindfulness and attention, organizational routines and knowledge, and character strengths and strength-based feedback. Did I say that right? Strength-based feedback. His teaching interests include organizational psychology, positive organizational scholarship, and negotiations and bargaining behavior. Before assuming a position at Weatherhead in 2010, seems like you've been here forever, but we're so glad you're here, served as a lecturer at the University of Michigan School of Business. He is the recipient of several awards, including Outstanding Reviewer from the Academy of Management Review and Best Paper Award from the University of California Davis Conference on Qualitative Research. In addition, he has been nominated for the Case Western Reserve and Weatherhead Teaching and Mentoring Awards. Stevens is the author of numerous articles, and his work has appeared in the Academy of Management Review, the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, the Oxford Handbook of Positive Organizational Scholarship, and other publications. He has presented his research at national and international forums and conferences, including the annual meetings of the Academy of Management. Currently, Stevens serves on the editorial board of Group and Organizational Management and is a former board member of the Academy of Management Review. Stevens he is originally from Trinidad and Tobago, but studied in the U.S. He received a bachelor's degree in psychology from Morgan State in Baltimore, Maryland, and a master's and PhD in organizational psychology from the University of Michigan. We are honored to have him with us today to participate in our Power of Diversity lecture series, and we look forward to his lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Paul Stevens.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Is everybody hearing me okay? Yes. Yes. Oh, great. So I'll have the mic and the clicker and my notes. And of course, there's an open cup of water here. So just to keep it interesting, so you'll see what happens. Thank you for that kind introduction, Dr. Mobley, and thank you to the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity here at Case Western Reserve University for inviting me to speak. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's great to see some friendly faces, some faces I don't know yet, but it says something about our campus community that you're all here today. I would also like to thank Stephanie Creary, a professor at the Wharton School, an expert on diversity at work, who was a good sounding board for me for some of these ideas and helped me think through what I wanted to share with you today. All errors and mistakes are my own, not hers. So first off, I have a confession to make, which I just made to Janetta yet again. I don't think of myself as a diversity scholar or a researcher or a consultant, right? I don't do diversity dialogues and trainings. Maybe I should, right? So now might be a good time to turn to your neighbor and ask, if you're in the right place. So why am I here? I'm here because I felt like maybe, just maybe, what I've learned over the past few years from my research on coordination and work relationships, from that vantage point, I might have something to say, something to share that might be helpful, a helpful perspective on the important topic of diversity. And in organizations and certainly higher education, like we've all experienced here at this university, we talk a lot about diversity, as Dr. Mobley just said. And that really is all about the extent to which a group or collective is comprised of many elements, right? So there's no such thing as a diverse person, no matter what the media likes to say, right? It's not a very helpful shorthand because it's wrong, right? But how we experience diversity, which is what I care about, what I want to talk about today, specifically in terms of inclusion and by we, I mean all of us, right? Whether we're in positions of high or low power, whether we're in the majority group or minority group, how we all experience inclusion matters. And by inclusion, I mean a sense of feeling seen and valued for who you are, right? This is what I care about. So this is why I got this image of inclusion that you saw here and probably wondering what it's about. But this is what you get when you Google inclusion, right? It's better when we're together, right? So across our differences, so not glossing over differences, not trying to all be the same, but actually appreciating and valuing those differences. And I think maybe most of us might agree, not just because you self-selected into this room this afternoon, but just when you read the news, that this is tough to accomplish, that it's been very tough to accomplish this as a country and as a globe, as a global community. Easier said than done. What's interesting when I started to look into the diversity research, and certainly I have students, I have fellow faculty members, I have friends who are on the front lines of trying to make organizations more diverse. Actually, we find that there is not a clear link between diversity practices like affirmative action or targeted recruiting and changes in how people actually experience their social connection. So there was a big review done of all these practices, which we know, which we can implement in our organizations, which have been around for quite a while. But the link between adopting those practices and how we actually feel about ourselves and our relationships at work actually is not straightforward and actually isn't well documented. So how we get from there to here to a better sense of inclusion actually isn't very clear. I don't have the magic pill, so sorry to disappoint, to solve this, but my goal today is to transfer lessons from what we know about coordinating across differences at work, which is actually quite a lot of the teamwork and coordination research that I hope to contribute to. Taking lessons from that set of research, that set of understanding and insights, and trying to transfer them to how we might foster inclusion in a broader sense. Even more ambitiously, something that I do care about in my own community, in my workplace, maybe even creating a sense of community, right? Where it's this sense of I belong here even though I'm different, right? And so that's sort of an ambitious goal. Can we get there somehow? So next, I'll say some more about my motivations for being here today, and then dive into 3 insights that we might draw from about stories about coordinating and creating something new together. And the first insight is about developing a more reflective stance in our relationships, which is tough. The second insight about co-creating something concrete. And the third insight about the style of conversations we might have to better understand each other. And then I'll wrap up. So first, I have a few stories to share about my motivations for getting up here in front of you today. For me, as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, which is one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the Caribbean, I grew up with diversity as a fact of life, whether that means religious diversity, ethnic diversity, racial diversity, and a sense of inclusion. Going to school in an all-boys Catholic primary school with the church right next to it, but then the mosque is down the street, and you have Hindu and Muslim and Rastafarian people in school with you. Not to say that everything was perfect, but that's just how you grew up, right? We have all these different peoples from these different backgrounds, and we're all in the same room together, all part of the same country. I'm sad to say, though, that the past few decades have seen an erosion in that sense of inclusion, and we now have political divisions in my country that sadly align with racial divisions. How we come out of that is an excellent question. As a college senior, I went to visit the University of Michigan in 2003. And I know it's dangerous to show this here in Northeast Ohio. And this was just as the university was becoming embroiled in a Supreme Court case regarding undergraduate affirmative action admissions policy. And then a few years later, in 2006, I believe, when I started to teach undergraduates, we had Prop 2, which actually outlawed affirmative action in public institutions. So imagine a foreign student starting off from undergrad into a PhD program, sort of being thrown into these conversations about affirmative action, what it means for higher education, what does it mean for your career, what does it mean to teach undergraduates who are concerned about how they're going to be seen in what is a pretty wealthy majority public institution. So that's kind of what I found myself in. You know, how do we talk about this? But cut to 2012 and the killing of Trayvon Martin, or to 2014 and the killing of Tamir Rice, which happened not too far from where I live, because I've always lived on the west side of Cleveland. And I grew frustrated with how management scholars who study how people manage differences at work. So I'm not talking about those who study diversity. We do have a robust line of research in our field on diversity in the workplace, but I'm talking about management scholars writ large. Folks like myself who study teamwork and coordination, we see a lot about how people manage difference. What do we have to say about it? You know, how are we becoming part of the conversation, becoming part of the discourse that we were seeing in the media? The point is that we weren't, really. So cut to 2016 and 2017, where political differences seemed to tear friendships and families apart. You know, I had a friend of mine who was about to ask his longtime barber to stand up in his wedding with him, and then effectively broke up with his barber when he found out he voted for Trump. With a set of mutual friends, I heard one advise the other to cut ties with his parents because of who they voted for the 2016 election. It's like, why are you even talking to your father, basically? You know, and these were friends who had grown up together, who knew and loved each other's parents. So it's really sort of like, what do we do with this? I don't know, show of hands, how many of you have stories like that or have heard stories like that? So that's quite a few of you in the room. So really my question, my motivation for being here today is, what in the world are we doing? Right? Just, you know, share frustration and curiosity about what else can we do, how else can we think about the situation, how else can we reframe the situation, and hopefully get on the path to doing things differently. You know, where do we go from here when our reactions are to cut ourselves off from our connections with each other? So it seems that as a society and as institutions, we can help support a more deliberate decision making to kind of slow things down, which, you know, I'm getting to my first main point here. Perhaps we can begin to note and take notice of our initial reactions and then question them. So in my field of organizational behavior, particularly about organizational development and change, we describe this in terms of single and double loop learning. So basically, single loop learning works like this. Right, so I have a program of action. Right, so you see here we have maybe a mental model, so a sort of script, something that we've learned, a path, right? We love our path of least resistance. So I have this pathway, I have these rules, I have this mental model, this idea in my head of how the world should be, and I follow it, right? So in the example used by the person who developed this, Chris Argyris, he talks about it like a thermostat, right? I set my thermostat to 68 degrees in the winter, because I like to sleep at 68 degrees. And then when the temperature drops below that, the thermostat kicks in more heat, right? So the thermostat is following some sort of decision rule. It's been programmed. Double loop learning, on the other hand, is when we actually reflect on our initial reactions. The thoughts, the words, the behaviors that seem to tumble out onto Twitter quite a bit, as an example. And before we click tweet, right, in double loop learning, before we click tweet on whatever we just typed, we can stop and think, why am I thinking, saying, or doing this? I know, radical, right? So in the thermostat analogy, Ardris says, maybe it's a thermostat asking, why am I set to 68 degrees? Right? What other temperature might achieve the goal of making the room more comfortable? So apart from you reflecting on the existential crisis of a thermostat, what I want you to really think about is that we are capable of so much more. We are capable of calling into question our own logics and goals as we navigate the world. So notice that I said our own logic and goals, not others, but ours. So now this might not sound like a lot of fun, right? Constantly checking in on yourself, deliberately asking what we're doing and why, because we're not built that way. Our brains love the path of least resistance. I had a friend on the phone today talking about the primitive brain, that reptile brain, some people call it, and this neocortex that we have, right? That makes us human. Right, so our primitive brain likes to take over, right? That's where the stereotypes and generalizations and mental models handed down to us over generations come into play. So we need to do something, right? We've been gifted with a bit more brain than just the primitive brain. We've built up whole societies and institutions and groups and families and neighborhoods through some degree of thoughtfulness. What I thought was interesting is that this double loop premise is actually being pursued by folks working with our youth. For example, Howard Stevenson, who's the director of Penn's Racial Empowerment Collaborative. And so the collaborative works on developing what they call racial literacy in youths in schools. I thought it was a really interesting example of putting this double loop learning to work. And by racial literacy, Stevenson means teaching kids to read the situation and their reaction to it, to recast their initial reactions, so it's not some overwhelming sense of dread, fear, or anger, and to then resolve the situation through practicing alternative responses. So for some of you, this may sound familiar. It's all based on mindfulness practices, asking yourself, what am I feeling? How am I feeling? And why? What kind of self-talk is coming up, right? What images are coming to mind? How do I manage that stress? And I'll say if this sounds burdensome, if it sounds like it takes practice, it does. Because we've all been part of this society. We've all been part of this globe. We've all been raised in certain families and cultures. We've all been programmed to a certain extent, I would wager. The question is, why take on this burden? I'll make the case that the stakes are too high for us to not take up this burden. Don't we want our neighbors, our family members, our co-workers, and our friends to put in the effort for some more double loop learning, asking what our deeper, bigger goals are when we either shy away from difference, try to normalize difference, or even shut the other person down? The currently fractured state of society, how we treat the poorest of our poor, how we take care of those in fear of their lives from other countries, and moving past the political gridlock which is leaving our science and infrastructure withering away, are certainly worth this extra effort. So in my next 2 points, I'd like to reflect on 2 themes from coordination and teamwork research and practice that flesh out this idea of a double loop kind of stance orientation. What if we actually took a look at the situation as we're in it? What would we change? What might we do differently? So now, as I said before, when we think of coordination, we think of synergy and synchrony, hopefully, and people coming together as a whole to create something new. And a lot of times in organizations, this has to take place across people in different roles or functions or professions who need to but don't always stay mindful of that bigger goal at stake. So we have sports teams. I know it's baseball season, but I know everybody's going crazy because Odell Beckham's coming. For the Browns, we have surgery teams and construction teams, right? Right, so it's sports teams and collaborative care and surgical teams in hospitals. You need that team to gel together to save your life, the life of a family member. With a construction team, you have consultants, architects, focus groups, engineers, trade contractors, suppliers. So all those people from different roles, different specialties coming together to produce something like this building that we're in, right? Part of what we do when we study coordination is to dig underneath the processes and patterns that unite or fracture groups. So what I find, though, is that there's often little in the coordination literature about how people handle their demographic differences, which is what we typically think about when we say the word diversity. What we do have instead in the research on coordination and teamwork is a lot of ideas and stories about how members of teams can collaborate through sharing ideas and transforming them into something new and unique. So typically the way it goes is like this. In order to do a really good job coordinating, folks have to share what they call the deep knowledge, right? So what are your assumptions about each other, your assumptions about the problem, about the task at hand, how does your specialty area intersect with my specialty area, right? And different teams might develop different ways of doing this, but it's a lot of work. It's really effortful. And sometimes you need it, but it can take a lot out of people. And in fact, if that's not facilitated well, all of that surfacing and talk and digging into differences can actually lead into some interpersonal conflict, right? It can actually lead to people focusing so much on how they're different that, they get into conflict. So sometimes some less deliberate kinds of methods might help us still honor and productively use the differences between us. So I want to focus on one study in particular to flesh out how this might be possible. This is research, if you're interested, done by Anne Mazrak, Philip Moore, and Samer Faraj, about how cross-functional teams transcend their knowledge differences, right? So they don't gloss over the differences, but they look to where they're connected more so than how they're different as a team. So in their research, they focused on 3 cross-functional teams from different companies charged with different tasks, like rethinking how to use physical space to promote collaboration, identifying best practices across a company to develop some sort of quality control system, things like that, right? So very different tasks. But what was similar across the 3 teams was that they all were cross-functional from different specialties, and they had no idea what they were doing, right? Very broad goals, not very well defined, and they also didn't know each other very well, right? So that's where you might see some of that first loop kind of learning, that first loop orientation. I don't really know you very well. All I know is you're the architect. All I know is you're the engineer. All I know is that you're from sales. So I already have these preconceived notions about your role, your background, what I expect you to do. You may have the same notions and models in your head about me, right? So those initial stereotypes and reactions could have gotten in the way of progress. What these researchers found instead is that these teams were all successful because they similarly engaged in some particular practices, right? And those practices helped to integrate each team member's knowledge into some sort of common solution without having to first flesh out what was different. So I think that's pretty interesting. So the researchers identified 5 key practices that all these successful teams engaged in, but I want to focus on just one, what they called co-creating a scaffold. So what these teams first did was they allowed each member to simply voice whatever came to mind as they tried to define the problem and define the potential solutions. So they just kind of threw things out off the top of their heads, like, so people on the team that was focused on buildings and space would say things like, we have noise problems, or what's the aesthetic here, right? So they're just kind of throwing things out. People on a strategy-focused team might say, we need social media. That company had a bad reputation, right? So they're all just kind of sharing. But what was interesting is that what they did with all of those fragments that got voiced by different team members is what I really think is important and curious. In the next step, they co-created what these researchers call a scaffold, right? So something that's a visual maybe, or even a verbal kind of representation that's tying together all those different fragments. What's important here is that as team members focused on the representation that they were building together, there was less focus on the individual differences and boundaries, right? They didn't need to learn each other's language, but instead focused on building a vibrant, evolving, collectively developed product. So as an example, the team focused on quality developed a spreadsheet of all the facilities, right? All the different facilities in the organization that all the team members could populate with the key things they wanted to see. Maybe I'm doing something. So they described this as something that people could throw rocks at, right? So something that's sort of emerging from all the different contributions that people didn't keep track of who did what. But they knew that this was something that belonged to the team, and it created space for everybody to contribute. The team focused on physical space and buildings, talked through how they might focus on the purpose for each building rather than the different spaces in a particular building. Right, so all this might sound pretty straightforward, but it is a departure from the idea that people had to really dig into differences first. Right? What these researchers were saying is that, well, let's have them build something together first and then kind of look back to see, well, how am I fitting in there? How do I contribute more? So in building that framework together without tracking who said what, that framework became something that belonged to the group rather than to one person or one specialty or one position of power. Right? And I'll keep saying this, we need to pay attention to the fact that these project teams didn't create common ground by glossing over the differences in perspectives or experiences or ideas. They got to common ground by asking, how do all these different inputs, how can they be useful together as a whole, right, in this scaffold? How do we build this together? How do we take all these different parts and create something whole? And with the scaffold in place, the team had some sort of common object, some sort of collective focus, something that they collectively own to engage in dialogue around, and which they could constantly reinterpret. They could move all these pieces of pipe around, right? They could move around how we place one fragment next to another. They could shift, right? So it was fluid. So the challenge then is, what does this mean when we talk about other kinds of diversity? Well, I think it invites questions about how a focus on what we're going to build together for people to use and find common ground in. Right? How do we transfer that idea of creating something together that we can commonly focus on? This idea of finding or creating scaffolds reminded me of the story of Daryl Davis. Did anyone ever hear Daryl Davis? Maybe you recognize him now. I don't know. Right? So he's the black blues musician known as the man that convinced 200 Ku Klux Klan members to give up their robes. So even though he published his book in 1998, his story got a lot of attention in 2017 in the wake of the protests and violence in Charlottesville. He says that over 30 years, right, he's had these dialogues with members of the Klan, and they've given up their robes to him. Incredible story, right? I love this story. I remember my jaw dropping as I sat in traffic hearing this come on the radio. And so I think this is somewhat related to scaffolding because he initially connected to the first Klansman over music. So he had just played a set at this bar. So he's sitting at the bar with a guy after he played. I don't want to get into too many details, but they're talking about music. And there was some disagreements over who invented what, white people or black people, right? So they're having a conversation. And towards the end of it, the Klansman admits that this is the first time he sat down to have a drink with a black person. And Davis doesn't believe him until the guy shows him his Klan card in his wallet. And I'll quote a little bit from the interview that was on National Public Radio a few summers ago. So Davis claims that it was the music that brought us together. The fact that a Klansman and a black person could sit down at the same table and enjoy the same music, that was a seed planted. So what do you do when you plant a seed? You nourish it. That was the impetus for me to write a book. I decided to go around the country and sit down with clan leaders and clan members to find out, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? Here's some really interesting stories in the interview. So he goes on, the best thing you do is you study up on the subject as much as you can. And so one way I could read that is opening himself up to difference, even as it's hateful difference. I went in armed, not with a weapon, but with knowledge. I knew as much about the clan, if not more than many of the clan people that I interviewed. When they see that you know about their organization, their belief system, they respect you. Whether they like you or not, they respect the fact that you've done your homework. And just like any good salesman, you want a return visit, and they recognize that I'd done my homework, which allowed me to come back again. He continues, that began to chip away at their ideology because when two enemies are talking, they're not fighting. It's when the talking ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. If you spend 5 minutes with your worst enemy, it doesn't have to be about race, it could be about anything. You will find that you both have something in common. As you build upon those commonalities, you're forming a relationship, and as you build about that relationship, you're forming a friendship. That's what would happen. I didn't convert anybody. They saw the light and converted themselves. End quote. So thinking about the scaffolds that connect us demands that we pull back from focusing on the differences that may spark a conflict to instead ask about the bigger picture. Right? And it's not that we ignore the differences, we just switch what's figure and what's ground, what's in focus. And what's in focus is what's our goal here together. And if there's no obvious goal, even though I think there always is, then what can we do to develop a goal together? Right? What can we do together? So in the project team's example and that of Daryl Davis, you can see how conversations could be used to create or find the scaffold that holds all our different perspectives in a way that brings us together. How the project team started off wasn't fully deliberate, and in his first conversation, Mr. Davis didn't intentionally plan on spending his evening educating a Klansman about where the blues really came from. While scaffolding helps people transcend their differences by giving them some kind of shared object to focus on, there's also a practice, a more deliberate practice, called conversations of interdependence. And that deliberately tries to flesh out differences and the connections between them. So you could go more or less deliberate in your method. So much of the work that I want to talk about next is based on work by Tony Suchman, who developed this form of facilitated dialogue in his work as a physician and a consultant. Tony's work is really, how do we make healthcare more relational? How do we increase the positivity and quality of the relationships that help provide care? And he's also done work with Jody Hoffer-Gittel, a Brandeis professor, who developed the concept and measure of relational coordination. So Tony's work on conversations of interdependence has been used to support better relational coordination in organizations. And by relational coordination, I just mean where people are using their relationships and communication to get their work done together. So now in a conversation of interdependence, people of different specialties or roles, like physicians, pharmacists, nurse anesthetists, nurse managers, etc., deliberately ask some pretty targeted questions to each other to develop shared knowledge about how their work intersects, right? So in a lot of jobs, everything's very siloed. You stay in your lane, I stay in mine, and somehow we get it done together, right? So going back to this idea of conversation, they ask questions like, what do you find most meaningful about your work? What do we need from one another? What is it about how I do my work that helps you to do yours? What about how I do my work that gets in your way? How could I do my work differently in ways that help you get your work done? What do you need to know from me? When do you need to know it? Very simple questions, but how many of us have asked those questions in our organizations? One person? God bless you. 2, 3, 4, hands keep coming. Great. I hope you keep doing that. When people start to share with each other just how much they depend on and impact each other, and I'm sure we hear from those who raise their hands later on, it can be pretty powerful. So in an example that might shock those of us as patients who may not be used to seeing how the sausage gets made in healthcare, right? In this example from Gittel's 2016 book, in one health system, one hospital, lab techs were helping to walk the urgent care staff through their process, right? And that's a really concrete way to flesh out the results of a conversation of interdependence. The urgent care staff began to ask in the walkthrough, so you mean if we send you a sample without a direct explicit order, it just kind of sits there? So wait, you have to throw out how much blood at the end of the day because it's spoiled or you never got an order? So there's these huge gaps in knowledge about how our work impacts other people's work, and then in turn, how that ultimately impacts the entire system, right? This approach of using conversations of interdependence, it's a lab, creating space for learning about others' needs and priorities in relation to yours is based on this perspective of seeing organizations as conversations. Part of learning about others through conversation is asking about and growing more sensitive to the part we play in their lives. So in Tony Suchman's work on this idea of organizations as conversations rather than as cold, rational machines, right? So maybe you've said on more than one Friday, I'm just another cog in the wheel, right? We have this machine metaphor, or very often we have a military metaphor for organizations. So Tony's saying, what about the idea of organizations as conversations? So if we think of them as conversations, we change a conversation, says Tony, not by creating a new blueprint for a machine, but because it's a conversation, we make change by changing how we participate and encouraging others to do likewise. Conversations are about give and take, right? They can't be one-sided. There's action and reaction. We set up patterns in this give and take, and these patterns are self-organizing and can be self-reinforcing, right? So we have something emerging out of the interplay of this give and take and action and reaction. Sometimes these patterns reinforce systems of domination and oppression. So I remember meeting some folks a while ago from a medical institution that will remain nameless years ago. They described witnessing a doctor publicly shaming a nurse. So shoving his name badge in her face while yelling, "Do you know who I am?" The fact that status, privilege, and perhaps class and gender could twist our interactions in such ugly ways is pretty sad, particularly when the quality of patient care, which is the work, right? The thing that we're all supposed to be focused on in that setting, particularly when quality of patient care gets caught in the middle. But even if patterns of conversation and interaction are self-reinforcing, they're still open systems. So that means we can change them. As Tony puts it, if we accept that these patterns are emergent, they're self-organizing, then we have to accept that we can't predict the direction that they're going to go in. Instead, we have to adopt a mindset of curiosity, flexibility, and experimentation. And it seems to me at times that we've lost this attitude or orientation towards curiosity about each other. We kind of assume by somebody's bumper sticker or maybe even saying who they voted for that we know all of their priorities, all of their experiences, all of their needs, all of their biases. The idea of a conversation rather than a speech presumes interdependence. We need each other. I need to hear from you in order to know what to say next. So like the scaffolds, the answers to the questions in such conversations help to reflect what we value together as part of something greater than ourselves. Since conversations are about continuing back and forth, it means that we each have an opportunity to create a shift by tweaking our own responses. I always tell my students, all we have control over is our own behavior. The question is, what do you do with that kind of knowledge? Attending to our own role in the patterns that get created means that not only can we learn about others more deeply, but we can also ask questions of ourselves, such as, what am I doing in this very moment that contributes to those patterns? How can I act differently to interrupt existing patterns and start new ones? This is something we can ask ourselves as we find that we're getting frustrated or heated or dismissive with others. For a conversation to be a conversation, there needs to be responsiveness and an openness to being changed by one another, an openness to learning something new about how we impact each other and not just in any one direction. So that means if you start a conversation about politics, are you actually open to hearing what the other person has to say? Let's think about that for a few minutes. Are we actually open to having our minds change? Part of the stance of using conversations to learn more about how we are more interdependent than we may seem is to accept that what I know about you will never be the whole story. It will never be complete. And this simply means we need to stay open to that continuous cycle of conversation, to continuously reconstruct our knowledge of how we mutually affect each other. So now I'm going to wrap up. So the lessons from how people coordinate and work together across different functions and specialties at work tell us that we might need to be both deliberate and less deliberate in some of our strategies. Right? The strategies to be more inclusive, to create a sense of inclusion. When faced with an unclear task and process, like the project teams, it might be necessary to kind of quickly jump in and gather all the voices at the table. Of course, making sure you have the necessary voices involved, right? So asking who's at the table. When there's already a well-defined task or problem, maybe more deliberate conversations about how we impact each other might be needed. So this shift from a single loop to a double loop kind of orientation is needed, I think, because times are urgent. So here's a taste of some recent headlines, all too easy to find. So white nationalist groups increase recruiting and propaganda across the Western United States, particularly in colleges and universities. And we know this university has not been immune to some of that. Author says New Zealand massacre points to a global resurgence of extremism. So the call is, in the face of all this, can we keep pulling together insights from across our disciplines to understand how people feel disconnected, isolated, and disaffected in ways that either lead them to being oppressed or engaging in oppression? My hope for today is that you leave here thinking about your own conversations and the story in progress that you are always creating with others. Maybe it will help to reflect on the scaffolds that you are building or not building, right? The visual or verbal pictures or frameworks that you are co-creating with your family, your friends, your neighbors, your teammates, your co-workers. Whenever you get together with people, what's the scaffold that's being created? Who's included in the conversation? Is everyone's voice getting heard? Even those voices we may not want to hear. How are we challenging each other to contribute to some bigger purpose or project? I think we have a nice, interesting example of scaffolding right here in our own backyard this year at Case Western Reserve University in the current Think Big strategic planning effort. Right? So you have the provost's office saying, challenging us as a campus community to come up with ways to deliberately bring us together across disciplines, across the street, across buildings, across programs, across lines of faculty and staff, all to create new connections that lift up our collective impact on our students and the world around us. And you have to back it up, right? So this is backed up with some money. That's just not going to happen. Right? So yeah, it's a seed sprint funding for interdisciplinary collaboration, right, which is meant to help bring together these different schools and programs across the university. I see these seed sprints as an institutional level kind of scaffolding where small teams are being encouraged and incentivized to build something concrete together, to co-create something that every different person on the team can find something to relate to, something to make productive use of each other's differences, rather than sharpening the boundaries. Because we have a lot of boundaries in this university. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out what think big really means, but what's at stake here, I think, is the life of this university. I've heard different students, staff, and faculty express this sense of being siloed or isolated or disconnected. Now, this is not unique to Case Western Reserve University, but at least we started to do something about it. As I close, I'd like to think that it's helpful to start seeing our involvement in society as being through conversation. How is that conversation deliberately fleshing out interdependence? And how is it helping to flesh out how we're impacting each other? When is it appropriate and helpful to do so? That's a question. Around which topics? That's a brave question. What might be the impact of accepting that it takes continuous construction and work to shape and reshape our approach and perceptions of each other? I think maybe that the impact might be seeing everyone as a story in progress, on a journey towards understanding, trying to find their own peace, even the people we don't like. We might start to see ourselves and others as stories in progress, constantly learning, changing, and growing. Thank you.
So, it's your time. Questions for Professor Stevens?
Question, right? I do have a couple comments. So one, I don't know if you're aware, but there's actually a triple loop process to that single double loop learning, which is asking, are we even asking the right questions? Mm. So is the problem even the thermometer? Maybe it's the thermostat, maybe it's something else, right? Mm-hmm. And then also, regarding inclusion, I think that the American psyche is unconsciously and consciously even focused on exclusion. And so I think there's a disconnect there. And I mean exclusion in terms of exclusivity. Like we strive for that. And I think that contributes to why we have silos. We have, we want to live in exclusive neighborhoods and go to exclusive schools, and everything is, honestly, is about exclusion, but at the same time, we're trying to create these environments that are supposed to be inclusive, so there's a disconnect there. And then finally, I think in terms of your project team, I like the idea of that, but in reality, we have people who are narcissistic, and we have real power dynamics that can get in the way of that. So if everybody came to that group with equal power, I think that scaffolding works well. But when you have people in the room who feel like they're more important than others, and that their voices should be heard above others, and who can't even hear others because of who they are, that kind of gets in the way of that as well.
Yeah, I agree with the those kind of you need those grounding conditions, right? That folks will actually be on the same page. What we're finding more now in management research and high performance work practices, organizations are explicitly hiring for relational competence. Yeah. Do you know how to play well with others? Or we will hire your company, but if the individual from that company, right, if we have a contract, if that individual doesn't know how to play well with others, please send someone else, or your contract is at risk. So more and more companies, of course, companies with enough power and money to do this, are taking that stance, which is an interesting trend to see. So no, thank you for those points. Yeah, John?
My question is, how does the role of affinity work within teams? So you think about, you're talking about a team working together and or like looking at the strategies and the double-minded, the thinking, right? The double loop. But how does affinity, so I think about in the role of, if it's only one person that identifies as in a certain identity group, how does that affect the team? If someone's not being related to and or understood from their perspective, how does that play into the work?
Does that make sense? I think so.
Okay.
I'll ask for clarity. Well, one thing that comes to mind is, I think what I was trying to say, maybe not maybe I was afraid of saying it as strongly, is sort of giving the work the priority in some senses. But I wanted to be careful about glossing over difference. Because it's one thing to say we're here to work, so keep all your personal stuff aside, keep all your other identities outside the door. Even though I don't think organizations are yet well equipped for people bringing their whole selves to work, which is what Stephanie Crary has been researching. So there's this question of, well, what do we do if somebody is gay or trans or, God forbid, Catholic, or whatever a difference is? How do we deal with that? And I mean, one sort of easy, I don't know if this is a cop-out, but having, I'll say, the right leadership as a start, which is just a start, right? So folks with the experience and the training and the appreciation who are setting those ground rules about respect. So respect came up a couple of times in Dow Davis's story. I certainly find respect comes up a lot in my own research on how people relate to each other and communicate with each other. I've been studying these large construction projects for the past 4 to 5 years now. And respect across difference is really, really, really important. I may not fully understand where you're coming from, but I hold this respect for you, which then correlates very strongly with trust. And we all know trust kind of trumps everything in what I've found in studying work relationships. So this respect and trust are very key. We know from our research too that if the leader doesn't model it, then it's probably not going to happen. So I don't want to put everything on the leader, but I think that's a linchpin. If that's missing, then you can't really predict much of anything else. So I think a leader who can set the tone for whether we understand this particular identity or not, we can still signal value and respect for this person. I know there's deeper responses to that, but I think that's one start for it too. Let me get Chris and then Estelle.
Thank you, Professor Stevens. One question I had was, you make the point that we never know somebody completely, and we need to be open to who they are in conversations. For example, if we have a political conversation, we were saying that, should we be open to hearing another point of view without bringing our own preconceptions? But my question is, isn't there a line that we all need to draw?
That's what I was thinking.
So if we are in a conversation with somebody and they want to advocate Nazism, for example, should we be open to having a conversation with that person? Or if they're going to advocate, something, I don't want to try to think of atrocious things, but there are lots of atrocious things in the world. So I really appreciated this whole scaffolding approach and particularly the need for open conversations. I think it's so important that we don't go in with ideas that we know or they're different, so on. But I just wanted your take on, is there a line that we should say, okay, I'm not willing to go there?
Yeah. So Chris Laszlo is a member of my department, and I told him not to ask any hard questions, and he completely ignored what I told him to do. So thank you, Chris. So yeah, as you were asking the question, I was thinking in my own experience. So this is not research-based. It's entirely idiosyncratic. But there's a line. But I'll tie it back to respect. So can you respect that I have this boundary? I think again, very personal and subjective, to abhor violence, maybe not as subjective, but to say, here's where I'm drawing the line with this conversation. I think at the risk of sounding too sort of facilitator-like in our conversations that we might have at the grocery store, even though I don't find people talk to each other at the grocery store or on the street or with a neighbor, Because I feel like we've all had maybe some surprise turns in conversation with folks that we thought we knew, and then they say something and you're like, wait a minute. Except you're trapped in the backseat of the car with them, so you don't want to get into a fight. This is a real memory. So, right, so then what do? So sometimes I'll admit I'm like, okay, I see where this is going. Let me just stop. Again, because I'm smushed in the backseat of a car next to you. But I think, again, going back to this metaphor of a conversation, if I'm being sensitive to the situation and sort of, is now the right time? Do I take this chance? And again, I'm talking about people that you may already know, right? I think there is room potentially, and this is all sort of experimentation at this point, to say, you have to understand that really maybe shakes me to my core, that really crosses a line for me. I want to keep this conversation going, but when we get to that point, right now I just can't continue with that. So there's some sort of, I don't know if the term is bracketing, but this idea of keeping the bigger goal and purpose in mind somehow. And again, this is all very tough. But saying like, if my goal is to learn along with you, if my goal is to be able to walk next to you as we move forward in life, then in this conversation, I am hoping to learn more about you, but understand that I'm going to have some reactions to that. And you're going to have some reactions to what I say. But we have to kind of bracket and create that holding space where it's like, we anticipate those reactions, and we know it's okay, and that maybe at this point in time, this conversation, we can only go to this point. So I'm thinking back to Darryl. I haven't read Daryl Davis's book, but this idea of him, there's a quote about, which maybe addresses your question. He's driving somebody, a Klansman in a car. I'll try not to butcher the quote. And the guy says, so all black people have a gene for, I think, violence or something like that. Right. And so Daryl Davis says to him, well, you've been with me all this time. I haven't tried to carjack anybody. I haven't tried to steal your money. And the guy quickly responds, yeah, your gene is latent. It hasn't expressed itself yet. So Daryl Davis, I don't know at what point in the 200 robes at this point he was on, but according to him, he says, so you think he's stumped, right? He's like, seriously? And he eventually responds, well, I think all white people have a serial killer gene. The guy's like, no, come on, like, what are you talking about, right? Obviously you're wrong. And he's like, well, no, think about, do you know any black serial killers? So the guy starts thinking about it. And all this is not real science, obviously. All right. But do you know any black, and the guy's like, well, no. And they start naming people. And then the guy's like, well, that's just dumb. And Daryl Davis says to him, well, that's as dumb as what you just told me. And then the guy leaves, because that was his boundary, that was his line in the sand. And then at some point later, he gave up his robe. Right? So I think I'm trying to put myself in Daryl Davis's shoes, because I've never been in that situation. I don't want to be in that situation, but I hope that if I am in that situation, I can think like that, where here's my big goal. My big goal is he's thinking as a salesman, to not lose this guy. Right? So there is some real hate and a history of violence that's embedded in a country, in a system that is full of prejudice and hate. But I'm in this car with this guy at this point in time. How do I keep this conversation going so I can get to the bottom of this? So I think that's amazing, right? So how do we aspire to that? I think that's the question on my mind. I don't have an answer to that. I think it's super skillful. I'm not that quick on my feet. But to kind of hold the space so that you can keep going to the layers underneath, even if the emotions are coming up. But I do know in my own personal life with folks that I already know where I may be surprised or maybe I feel put upon or discriminated against. I have said, you know what, I really want, what I value is the connection with you, but here's kind of where I draw the line. You know, do you agree with that? Maybe that line will move as we advance, but I really want to find ways to stay connected with you. Let me go to Estelle. Sure.
The holding the mic, is that right?
Yes.
So I had a couple of thoughts. The first one is that, JP, I really appreciate you starting out by talking about a need for reframing how we approach these issues, because our current tactics, strategies on a wide scale are clearly failing us. If we were to look, well, I can just look at my personal experience, but beyond that, if we were to look at the national landscape and even the international landscape, we can see clear failure and harm being done to persons. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is that I appreciate you referring to scaffolding. I'm very familiar with the work of Howard Stevenson, and have met and taught with him a few times, and he does a lot of work with men and boys of color. And so his situatedness in the school environment and in learning and development conversations, I think, has some value for this conversation in a higher ed environment as well. Primarily around, I'm going to connect to another concept around this idea of navigating difference. I would take the stand that we can't get to inclusion without going through conflict. And our orientation to conflict, or how we approach or navigate, internalize, perceive difference, is the mindset that we have to start with addressing. When we talk about common ground, even though in this environment in particular, we can intellectualize that doesn't assume kumbaya, but when you talk about common ground, there's something culturally situated within us that says, okay, let's look for no conflict, let's look for, I mean, honestly, I think to get to common ground, sometimes you have to move through conflict. I mean, you can identify places or things that you have in common, but you also have to build common ground to get work done. So I wonder about the strategies for us learning how to, as facilitators or educators, create scaffolding. Not just to identify what the scaffold is, but to create scaffolding with groups, you know, with teams, with communities, so that everybody actually owns it and they're open to mindset change and creating the common ground. So those are kind of the questions that are rolling around in my head about, I guess, diversity and inclusion broadly.
Well, I don't know if I have a direct answer to all those questions. Thanks, Estelle, for all. No, because I know you've done work in this area, but the thing with conflict, I think sort of keeping your eyes on the prize of what's the bigger goal here. I think back to when I teach negotiations to undergrads, some of that comes out. We're trying to change the framing from win-lose to win-win, but not just win-win, because that kind of only goes so far, but also like, what is this collective thing that we're gaining by sitting at the table together? And I always tell my students at the beginning of class, beginning of the semester, you know, no touching, you know, no, and they laugh, but emotions run high eventually, because as they role play every week. And I think there is something to, you know, I started off to talk about experience and the felt sense of inclusion. There is something to having people perhaps role play, perhaps, and just engage in a conflict. You can't wait till it's real, right? So practicing in our pedagogy, perhaps creating instances where it's okay to fail, it's okay to engage in conflict, because in the classroom, perhaps, or something else, that's part of the university, there's a structure in place to handle that, right? And having people see conflict play out, and then how that can be constructively be resolved, I think I don't think we have a lot of that in our classes. So how do we structure that in? And I think also as instructors, we were afraid of that. Ooh, some tough conversations over the past few years, right? And so maybe kind of stepping up to that and saying, well, how do I anticipate it? And then also create, maybe it's a module, maybe it's a class, maybe it's an exercise where we do have people do it, or maybe you role model it as the instructor. That's another kind of approach. So maybe that's a start to it.
Thank you for the questions. I just realized the time, and I think we're out of here at 4:30. So we have refreshments. We have a few refreshments left. Can you help me thank Dr. Stevens for his presentation? I want to let him know how much I appreciate an occasion. We had a social justice event after Tamir Rice. Do you remember this? And I remember this as a professor who I hadn't heard speak very much. And so as I listen to your single loop, double loop conversation idea, I think about the time when you came and I thought you were just going to be a spectator. And so I think some of this work requires courage in real time, courage to interrupt the conversation that's at play, to say, I've got to say something really difficult here. And I thought on that occasion you said something very difficult about how our degrees and our cars and our zip codes, whatever you want to put on that list, sometimes will not protect you from discrimination. And I hadn't heard you speak very much in public, and he spoke, and wow, it was courageous to say that. And so I appreciate this conversation you've started us on today. And so let us thank him and have refreshments.
Thanks, everybody.